January 12, 1945. The bitter wind cut across the plains of southern Oklahoma, rattling the barracks of Camp Clinton. Snow, rare but stubborn, lay in drifts around the barbed wire fences. Inside, the clatter of boots on wooden floors echoed off the walls. A new group of prisoners had arrived, exhausted, weary, their uniforms stiff with winter frost. Among them, one figure stood out, a young German woman. Barely 19, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had been trained to expect cruelty, discipline, and the harsh hand of enemy soldiers. Yet, as the gates swung open and US soldiers greeted her with calm, organized efficiency, her mind struggled to reconcile what she saw. No jeers, no malice. Only measured voices, hot meals, and blankets waiting for the newcomers. In that moment, the war she thought she understood, the rigid, merciless machinery of battle, suddenly seemed different. The humans behind the uniforms were not monsters. They were soldiers, and they were kind. It was a shock that would ripple through her entire perception of the war. The next step naturally flows into the context. Section 1, where we set the stage of the European theater, the defeat of Germany and US military handling of POWs. By January 1945, the war in Europe had reached a tipping point. Germany, once a formidable juggernaut, was reeling on multiple fronts. The Red Army had pushed across Poland and eastern Germany, their relentless advance crushing any pockets of resistance. In the west, Allied forces moved steadily from France and Belgium into the heart of the Reich, their tanks and artillery carving paths through cities and countryside alike. The Luftwaffe, once the dominant air force in Europe, was reduced to fragments, struggling against Allied bombers and fighter sweeps that patrolled the skies relentlessly. Amidst this chaos, the German army faced unprecedented challenges. Supplies were scarce, communication lines disrupted, and morale, already fragile, eroded under the weight of constant retreat and the knowledge that defeat was inevitable. The Nazi propaganda machine continued to demand loyalty, portraying the Allies as ruthless and inhumane. For young soldiers, and especially for those who had been indoctrinated from childhood, the concept of surrender was foreign, even terrifying. Across the Atlantic, the US military prepared to receive an influx of prisoners. Unlike the brutal methods often imagined by German propaganda, the US Army followed strict regulations set out by the Geneva Convention. POW camps were designed for containment, yes, but also for humane treatment. Officers and enlisted men alike were trained in procedures for processing prisoners' registration, medical checks, assignment of quarters, and organized routines that mirrored military discipline without cruelty. The intent was clear. Orderly camps minimized unrest, maintained morale among the captives, and projected an image of moral superiority to both allies and enemies. For a young female soldier, these policies would be incomprehensible. In the German view, surrender meant humiliation, and prisoners could expect harsh treatment at the hands of the enemy. Tales circulated about harsh interrogations, meagre rations, and relentless guard cruelty. Yet in the US camps, every soldier, from the sergeant issuing orders to the private serving meals, was instructed to treat prisoners with decency. This was not mere propaganda, it was military policy, enforced through meticulous training and oversight. In the midst of winter, as trucks delivered exhausted German soldiers to the Midwest, the camps operated with clockwork precision. Each prisoner received medical evaluations within hours, warm blankets in barracks heated against the cold, and rations that, by European wartime standards, were abundant. Even the smallest gestures, soup ladles full of hot broth, a clean mattress, A word of explanation for camp rules contradicted the expectations of those who had been steeped in Nazi discipline. The psychological impact on captives was immediate. Many German soldiers, hardened by years of indoctrination, struggled to process what they saw. The guards were uniformed, armed, and capable, but they were not hostile. Their questions were methodical, their movements predictable. The shock of encountering an enemy who acted not out of vengeance, but out of duty created a cognitive dissonance that would linger for weeks, even months. Among these captives, the young woman stood at the center of an extraordinary moment. She had seen enough of the European war to anticipate brutality, the bombing of Dresden, the encirclement at Stalingrad, the relentless push of Allied forces in France. She had heard the stories: prisoners beaten for minor infractions, left to endure winter in open compounds, or threatened with death. And yet, here she was, sheltered from the cold, greeted with calm voices, guided to her bunk with care. This was the context in which her disbelief took root. It was not merely the warmth or the efficiency of the US soldiers. It was the fundamental contradiction to everything she had been taught to expect. The war, in her mind, was a theater of cruelty, where enemy soldiers were monsters and survival depended on suspicion and fear. But the reality of Camp Clinton and other similar US POW facilities was different. It was structured, humane, and paradoxically kind. It would take time for her to reconcile this with her previous beliefs. But these first hours, these first moments of interaction with her captors, set the stage for a profound shift in perspective. The war, she realized, was not only a contest of armies and weapons. It was a confrontation of ideas, of ethics, and of humanity itself. Her story, while singular, reflected a broader truth about the handling of POWs in the United States. Across the country, thousands of German prisoners would experience similar shock. From the moment of arrival, they were confronted not with the monstrous enemy portrayed in propaganda, but with a disciplined, ordered, and surprisingly humane force. This first impression would mark the beginning of an emotional journey, one that challenged assumptions, broke expectations, and revealed the quiet, often overlooked, human dimensions of war. The convoy rumbled along the frost-lined roads, a mix of trucks and military, jeeps carrying dozens of prisoners from rail depots in the Midwest. Inside the wooden crates and canvas-covered beds, the young German woman pressed herself against the walls, shivering. Not from cold, but from anticipation. Every shadow outside seemed like a potential threat. Every footstep echoed her deepest fears. As Camp Clinton's gates came into view, barbed wire glinting faintly in the weak January sun, the officers on the trucks issued calm instructions. Step down carefully. Follow the line. Keep moving. There was no shouting, no barking of orders meant to intimidate. Only measured commands, precise and professional. When she finally stepped onto the gravel courtyard, the scene struck her with quiet force. US soldiers, bundled against the cold, were guiding prisoners into orderly lines. Nurses attended to the sick or weak. Clerks began processing paperwork at tables, ticking boxes on forms, recording names, ranks, and serial numbers. There was structure here, yes, but there was also care. Blankets were distributed before any questioning began. Hot soup was waiting in large pots, steaming gently in the chilly air. For a woman trained under the strictest Nazi codes, this was unimaginable. In Germany, the idea of a female soldier was already unusual, often relegated to auxiliary duties, communications, or medical service. And to face captivity was to expect humiliation or abuse. Yet here, She was treated with a formality that bordered on civility. A sergeant handed her a blanket, offering a simple, "This will keep you warm." No mockery, no sneer. Inside the barracks, the reality became even clearer. Rows of cots were spaced evenly, each with a mattress, pillow, and clean sheets. The wood floor creaked underfoot, but the room smelled faintly of pine and soap, not the acrid stench of fear she had anticipated. Guards patrolled silently, weapons at the ready, yet their eyes were calm. They were attentive, not threatening. Meals followed a precise schedule: breakfast, lunch, dinner. Bread, soup, meat when available, vegetables, sometimes even fruit. Prisoners were allowed to form small groups, converse quietly, and maintain personal hygiene routines. The camp adhered strictly to Geneva Convention guidelines. Showers were scheduled, laundry was available, and medical care was accessible. It was a stark contrast to her expectations. In her mind, capture had always meant degradation, a loss of agency, a stripping of dignity. Here there was structure, yes, but also a recognition of humanity. The US military had created an environment that reduced rebellion and unrest, not through fear, but through fairness. Guards enforced rules with authority, but without cruelty. And for those who feared betrayal or violence, this was both comforting and disorienting. The psychological impact was subtle but profound. Over the first days, she observed interactions among prisoners and soldiers alike. Younger soldiers whispered quietly among themselves, sharing stories of their homes. Older officers maintained decorum, but were clearly relieved to receive decent treatment. The US soldiers, meanwhile, moved efficiently, treating each individual with the same measured respect. There were no special privileges, but there was fairness. No one was singled out for humiliation. Even the smallest acts mattered. When she dropped a bowl during the first communal meal, a soldier bent down, handed her a mop and a rag, and smiled reassuringly. In Germany, such a mistake might have earned a scolding, or worse. Here it was met with a quiet correction, an opportunity to learn rather than an occasion to punish. Letters were allowed, and she could see other prisoners writing home with pens and paper supplied by the camp. It was an opportunity for connection, a chance to maintain a sense of normalcy in a situation that could have easily been dehumanizing. Even the daily roll call, usually a tense moment in militarized camps, was conducted calmly, without intimidation. This environment created a slow transformation in perception. The young woman began to notice nuances, the subtle kindness in routine, the predictability of safety, the absence of arbitrary cruelty. She started to see the US soldiers not as faceless enemies, but as individuals, men and women, performing their duty with competence and, unexpectedly, compassion. By the end of her first week at the camp, disbelief had given way to quiet reflection. The war she thought she understood, the rigid, the merciless struggle between soldiers and nations, was not the full story. Humanity persisted even amid chaos. Discipline and care could coexist, and for a German soldier trained to expect nothing but brutality from the enemy, this realization was both shocking and transformative. The first impressions of Camp Clinton were not merely logistical, they were moral. They challenged the assumptions embedded in her upbringing, in the ideology of her nation, and in her personal experience of war. And these initial experiences would set the stage for the defining moments to come. Moments that would test not only her expectations, but the very limits of human empathy in wartime. For the young German woman, the shock of humane treatment was deeply personal. She had been trained to see the Allies as merciless, to anticipate cruelty as a natural extension of war. Yet in Camp Clinton, her every expectation was subverted. Daily routines were predictable, orderly, and, most importantly, considerate of human needs. Food was adequate, warmth was provided, and her fellow prisoners were allowed to preserve their dignity. This human element went beyond mere survival. The soldiers' interactions, simple greetings, small smiles, careful instructions, communicated a respect that was unfamiliar to her. She noticed how guards helped the elderly prisoners carry heavy bundles or assisted those too weak to reach the mess hall quickly. Compassion, she realized, was not weakness, it was an effective way to maintain order. The impact on morale was subtle but profound. Prisoners who had entered the camp tents, suspicious and fearful, gradually began to relax, their fear giving way to cautious trust. In letters sent back to Germany, where censorship filtered out overt admissions of surprise, she struggled to describe what she experienced. Words like decency and kindness felt inadequate, almost alien. Her disbelief mirrored that of countless others, both male and female, who were forced to reconcile their indoctrinated image of the enemy with the reality before them. Tactical angle. From a tactical perspective, humane treatment of POWs was not merely ethical, it was strategic. The US military understood that orderly camps reduced the risk of rebellion, escape, or unrest. Every element of camp life was designed to minimize friction while maximizing control. Structured routines, clear chains of command, and consistent application of rules ensured that prisoners were predictable and manageable. Camps like Clinton also served broader strategic purposes. Captured soldiers could be observed and interrogated, revealing valuable intelligence about troop movements, morale, and enemy tactics. In this sense, the humane treatment of POWs was a calculated tactic. A content prisoner was more likely to provide information willingly, or at least without resistance. Moreover, the treatment of female prisoners presented a unique tactical dimension. Women were fewer in number, often serving auxiliary or communications roles, and their presence raised moral and logistical challenges. By maintaining a humane environment, the US military minimized complications and prevented incidents that could attract negative attention, both domestically and internationally. Every act of civility was a subtle reinforcement of American efficiency and moral authority. Leadership at the camp reflected deliberate planning and strict adherence to policy. Officers at every level were trained in both the Geneva Convention and practical camp management. Commanders understood that the perception of authority rested not only on enforcement, but on consistency, fairness, and predictability. The sergeant guiding the young woman to her bunk, the clerk checking paperwork, the nurse offering medical attention, all were acting under a shared leadership philosophy: maintain order, ensure well-being, and uphold American principles. Deviations were not tolerated, but harshness was actively discouraged. This approach created a chain of accountability. Every soldier understood that cruelty or favoritism could disrupt morale, incite unrest, or damage international reputation. Leadership in this environment was subtle yet visible. Decisions were made to balance discipline with care, authority with empathy. Every interaction was a reflection of this philosophy, from the careful assignment of cots to the measured enforcement of rules. For prisoners trained to fear arbitrary power, this was both disorienting and enlightening. The young woman observed how officers exercised authority, not through terror, but through competence, planning, and ethical responsibility. These three angles, human, tactical, and leadership, intersected to create a unique environment. The US Military's deliberate policies produced a camp that was efficient, secure, and morally grounded. For the young German woman, it was an awakening. The enemy she had imagined as cruel and unrelenting revealed itself instead as structured, competent, and unexpectedly humane. Even in the first week, she began to notice subtle patterns. Guards interacted with prisoners differently depending on behavior, but discipline was always predictable. Meals were rationed fairly, not based on favoritism. Medical attention was given without prejudice. Each instance reinforced the lesson that decency could coexist with authority. These angles set the stage for the deeper moral and cultural shocks she would encounter. The tactical efficiency of the camp, the disciplined yet humane leadership, and the recognition of individual dignity together created moments of surprise and reflection. For her, every observation became a test of prior beliefs. Could the enemy truly act with humanity? Could a system built on military discipline also be compassionate? The story of one young woman, standing in a barracks and absorbing the quiet order around her, became a lens through which to examine a broader truth, that even in war, human decency could prevail, and that policy, leadership, and ethics could intersect in ways that profoundly affected those caught in the machinery of conflict. From the German side, the situation was difficult to reconcile with everything they had been taught. Nazi propaganda had framed the Allies as ruthless, immoral and vengeful, an unstoppable force that punished any hint of weakness with cruelty. For a young female soldier steeped in this worldview, the reality of Camp Clinton was jarring. The soldiers she now observed were competent, armed, and fully capable of exerting force. But they did not. Other German prisoners shared her disbelief. Conversations in the barracks were hushed, cautious. "Why are they kind?" One officer whispered. Another soldier, older and battle-weary, added, "It is a trap. They are hiding something." The very absence of expected cruelty became a source of anxiety. In the enemy's eyes, any act of humanity was suspect. Yet, as days passed and no harm came, the prisoners were forced to confront a reality outside their indoctrination. These soldiers were enemies, yes, but also humans with standards, protocols, and, unexpectedly, empathy. This tension between expectation and reality shaped the prisoners' behavior. Initially defensive, even suspicious, they slowly adapted, learning to navigate the rules and routines without fear. Trust was born not from ideology, but from consistent, predictable treatment. For the young woman, it was an emotional shock, one that challenged deeply held notions of morality and power in wartime. Morals, cultural angle, the contrast between American and German approaches to warfare was stark, especially when it came to prisoners. German soldiers had been trained to value obedience above empathy, to interpret compassion as weakness, and to see every interaction as a potential power struggle. In contrast, the US military emphasized adherence to law, ethical treatment, and respect for human dignity, even in the context of captivity. This cultural gap was evident in daily interactions. Guards spoke calmly, gave instructions clearly, and ensured that prisoners' basic needs were met. Meals were distributed fairly, not used as leverage. Medical attention was available to all, regardless of rank, even small courtesies. A blanket offered without demand. A simple explanation of camp rules carried enormous weight. For the female prisoner, these differences were deeply unsettling. She had been conditioned to expect hostility and fear in every encounter with the enemy. Instead, she encountered structure, fairness, and a recognition of individual worth. The cultural and moral implications were profound. War, she realized, was not merely a battle of weapons, but also a contest of ethics, ideology, and human behavior. This moral contrast also influenced the wider camp dynamic. German prisoners began to observe each other, noticing how their fellow soldiers reacted to kindness and structure. Suspicion slowly gave way to cautious cooperation. In some cases, the humane environment prompted reflection, even personal growth, a psychological side effect that American leadership had anticipated but did not overtly exploit. Technological logistical angle. The camp's technological and logistical systems were equally remarkable. From intake to daily routines, every process was meticulously planned. Sleeping arrangements were standardized, medical facilities were equipped for emergencies, and communication systems ensured both efficiency and security. Even mundane tasks, laundry, mess distribution, mail delivery, were executed with precision. This level of organization contributed directly to the humane environment. Predictable routines minimized confusion and anxiety among prisoners, while clear protocols prevented abuse or favoritism. Guards, trained to follow strict schedules, acted consistently, reducing the risk of arbitrary punishment. In effect, technology and logistics became instruments of ethical conduct, supporting the moral framework established by leadership. The camp's infrastructure also allowed for oversight and accountability. Reports were logged daily, ensuring that any mistreatment could be identified and addressed. Medical staff maintained records of injuries and illnesses, while clerks monitored supplies and rations. Even small details, such as heating the barracks during harsh winter nights, were evidence of a system designed to uphold human dignity without sacrificing military control. For prisoners accustomed to chaos, scarcity, and unpredictability, these technological and logistical efficiencies were astonishing. The young woman observed how coordination and planning could create a sense of safety and stability, even in captivity. Every element, from the positioning of beds to the scheduling of meals, reinforced the message that prisoners were not objects to be dominated, but humans to be managed responsibly. The combination of these angles, enemy perspective, moral and cultural contrast, and technological logistical efficiency, painted a complete picture of the shock experienced by the young German prisoner. Each angle reinforced the other's. Human decency was amplified by leadership, strategy, and infrastructure. The U.S. military's approach, methodical and consistent, became a silent but powerful lesson in the ethics of war. These angles lead naturally into the climax, turning point, where the young woman experiences her definitive shock, the moment when theory and expectation collide fully with reality, leaving an indelible impression on her understanding of the war and her captors. It was January 15, 1945, 3 days into her stay at Camp Clinton. Snow still lingered in patches across the parade ground, but inside the barracks, warmth and light offered a quiet contrast. The young woman had begun to settle into routines, meals, roll calls, and briefings, but unease lingered beneath her calm exterior. She knew this environment was unfamiliar. She also knew that war had a way of revealing harsh truths at the worst possible moment. The defining incident occurred during the distribution of winter clothing. Prisoners had been issued new coats, gloves, and boots, items that, under normal circumstances, would have been routine. For the young German woman, however, this simple act became transformative. A private approached her with a heavy coat, noticing that her gloves were torn. Instead of simply handing them over, he knelt, adjusted the fit, and offered her a spare pair, explaining gently how to fasten the buttons to prevent wind from entering. She froze. Her mind raced. In Germany, gestures like this were reserved for comrades of equal rank, and only under strict supervision. Enemy soldiers, if they were even capable of such attention, would have done this sarcastically or conditionally. Yet here, a stranger, an armed man, capable of inflicting punishment, was acting solely out of care. There was no expectation, no hidden motive, no malice. The barracks were quiet, but every prisoner could feel the subtle tension of disbelief. She observed the scene closely. The private smiled, then moved on to assist another prisoner with a blanket. The orderly, efficient movement of the camp continued uninterrupted. The young woman's heart pounded, not in fear, but in confusion. She could not reconcile what she saw with the world she had known. Later that day, she witnessed another moment that deepened the shock. In the mess hall, an older prisoner accidentally dropped his bowl of soup. A U.S. corporal immediately stepped forward, offering a replacement and helping him clean up. Again, there was no scolding, no hint of mockery, only calm intervention. The young woman watched silently, her disbelief growing. These soldiers were acting out of protocol, but also out of compassion. Every small gesture chipped away at the expectations built by years of indoctrination. By mid-afternoon, the psychological weight of these experiences became overwhelming. She found herself alone in the barracks, sitting on her cot, and reflecting on the cumulative shock of 3 days. The predictable structure of camp life, combined with repeated demonstrations of decency, had created a cognitive dissonance that left her exhausted. It was not fear or intimidation that defined her captivity, it was understanding. She had come expecting cruelty and injustice. She had found discipline and humanity. Her peers noticed the change. A few whispered that she looked different, calmer yet alert, as if she had absorbed a truth too complex to articulate. For them, too, the camp was revealing a quiet lesson that war was not merely a contest of violence, but also a test of character. The contrast between the horrors they had witnessed in Europe and the measured kindness of their captors was stark, almost impossible to digest. That evening, the young woman was assigned to assist with minor tasks in the medical tent. She observed nurses administering care, guards checking on sick prisoners, and clerks organizing records. Every action was deliberate, respectful, and humane. When a young male prisoner expressed fear about an upcoming medical inspection, she instinctively offered reassurance, mirroring the care she herself had received. For the first time, she realized she was internalizing the lessons of the camp, adopting a mindset previously unimaginable. The climax of disbelief came as the sun set, casting a pale glow across the snow outside. She stepped onto the barracks porch and looked over the orderly rows of cots, the watchtowers, and the courtyard where prisoners quietly moved about. Each detail reflected discipline, but also intentional kindness. The war, she understood, had not ended with this small corner of Oklahoma. But within these fences, humanity had not been abandoned. It was in this moment that the full scope of shock registered. She could not reconcile the image of the enemy soldier she had carried in her mind, harsh, unfeeling, cruel, with the reality before her organized, armed, yet fundamentally humane. The recognition was jarring, almost unbearable, because it forced her to confront not only the conduct of others, but her own assumptions, prejudices, and the limits of indoctrination. This was the turning point. From this day forward, she would no longer see captors solely as opponents. She would recognize them as people shaped by law, discipline, and moral choice. The camp, designed for containment, had become a classroom, and the lessons it imparted would leave an indelible mark on her perception of war, loyalty, and humanity itself. The events of this day set the stage for further moments that would crystallize the young woman's transformation as she continued to interact with the U.S. soldiers, observe their conduct, and witness small but profound acts of decency that defied expectation. The days that followed solidified the young woman's dawning realization. By January 16, the camp had settled into its rhythm. She watched with growing fascination as the U.S. soldiers carried out their duties. Guards, medics, clerks, and officers moving in a synchronized, almost ritualistic precision. Yet this efficiency was not sterile, it was purposeful and humane. Every act, from distributing rations to guiding a confused prisoner to the mess hall, reinforced a single truth: authority did not require cruelty. One afternoon, she witnessed an incident that crystallized her disbelief. A young German soldier, barely 17, had arrived at the camp exhibiting signs of severe frostbite. The officers immediately intervened. Medical personnel applied warmth and treatment, while guards stayed close to ensure both safety and privacy. The girl watched as the soldier trembled, his eyes wide with fear and pain. A U.S. nurse knelt beside him, offering calm reassurance, speaking in a voice so gentle it seemed impossible in the context of war. She felt her chest tighten, struggling to reconcile her expectations with the reality before her. Soldiers capable of lethal force were acting as caretakers. The night brought another revelation. Prisoners were allowed a brief period of personal reflection in the barracks, writing letters or reading by lamplight. She sat beside a fellow German, sharing a cot for warmth, and for the first time in weeks felt a semblance of safety. Conversations were tentative, honest, and human. They spoke not of strategy or ideology, but of family, homes, and the surreal kindness they had encountered. It was a stark contrast to the indoctrination they had received, that the enemy existed solely to destroy and oppress. Even seemingly minor acts carried weight. The young woman observed a corporal assisting an elderly prisoner with a blanket, another soldier helping a man clean spilled porridge. No words were exchanged beyond polite guidance. No sarcasm, no mockery. The actions spoke for themselves. They were small, almost imperceptible gestures, but in the mind of a prisoner trained to expect malice, they were monumental. By January 18th, she began to engage with the soldiers herself. At first cautiously testing boundaries, she asked a private a question about camp rules. His reply was calm, explanatory, and without judgment. She noticed his patience, the absence of exasperation or irritation. In that brief interaction, a barrier collapsed. The enemy was no longer an abstract threat. He was a human being capable of empathy, fairness, and respect. The culmination of her shock came during a scheduled inspection of the barracks. An officer walked methodically through the rows of cots, checking supplies and ensuring compliance with regulations. Prisoners straightened themselves and their belongings, expecting rebuke or scolding. Instead, the officer offered quiet encouragement, noting improvements and thanking individuals for cooperation. The young woman felt her disbelief reach its peak. Authority was exercised not through fear, but through guidance. The hierarchy of power was intact, but it was exercised ethically. This experience transformed not only her perception of the captors, but also her understanding of war itself. The conflict was no longer solely a clash of armies. It was a human endeavor, shaped by choices, ethics, and behavior. She realized that morality could coexist with discipline, and that combat did not necessitate cruelty. Each U.S. soldier she observed reinforced this lesson. Their efficiency, calmness, and attention to humanity created an environment where fear could coexist with safety, authority with kindness. In quiet moments, she reflected on the contrast between her expectations and reality. In Germany, the image of the enemy was absolute and brutal. Capture was synonymous with humiliation. Here, the opposite was true. The POW camp, designed for containment and order, had become a testament to human decency under the most extreme circumstances. It was a revelation that would echo through the remainder of her captivity, shaping her interactions, her trust, and her understanding of what it meant to be human amid war. By the end of that week, the young woman's disbelief had transformed into cautious comprehension. She still observed rules and maintained caution, but the initial shock had evolved into insight. The acts of care, fairness, and ethical authority she witnessed daily challenged everything she had been taught about enemies, power, and morality. Her story, while deeply personal, mirrored that of many German prisoners. Across the United States, POWs were learning similar lessons, that the enemy could act with integrity, that discipline did not require cruelty, and that human decency could survive even within the machinery of war. For her, this turning point marked the moment when captivity ceased to be merely a test of endurance and became instead a profound moral and psychological confrontation. A confrontation that would linger long after she left the camp. The days following her initial shock brought a gradual adaptation. By late January 1945, the young German woman had begun to understand the rhythms and expectations of Camp Clinton. What had once seemed alien, the fairness, the routine, the consistent kindness of the U.S. soldiers, became familiar, almost predictable. She no longer flinched at simple gestures, no longer questioned every word or movement of her captors. For prisoners like her, adaptation was both psychological and practical. Life in the camp demanded compliance with rules, but those rules were reasonable. Roll calls were orderly, inspections were predictable, and routines were communicated clearly. Meals were consistent, medical attention available, and living spaces maintained. Within this structure, prisoners discovered a small measure of autonomy. Opportunities to write letters home, to converse quietly with fellow captives, to engage in approved recreational activities. Each allowed them to reclaim fragments of normal life amid the constraints of captivity. Reports from Camp Clinton, later preserved in U.S. Army archives, confirm that the young woman's experience was not unique. Officers routinely recorded observations of prisoner behavior, noting that humane treatment had measurable effects on morale and compliance. Prisoners who had initially resisted instructions or who appeared nervous and defensive gradually demonstrated cooperation. Letters, diaries, and oral histories collected after the war describe a similar pattern: initial disbelief, followed by cautious trust, and eventually acceptance of the camp's order and care. Interactions between prisoners and guards became more nuanced. While authority remained clear, there was an emerging mutual understanding. Guards treated prisoners with respect, and prisoners began to respond in kind. The young woman found herself assisting fellow captives, helping them navigate camp routines, and even advocating for those who were ill or struggling. In subtle ways, she became a bridge between her peers and the U.S. personnel, an intermediary shaped by both shock and insight. At the same time, the psychological impact of her early experiences persisted. The initial disbelief, the sense that human decency could coexist with authority and control, left a lasting impression. She observed moments of kindness with heightened awareness, mentally cataloging examples, a soldier adjusting a blanket, a nurse offering reassurance, a corporal explaining a camp rule without impatience. Each moment reinforced a new understanding. The enemy was not a monolith of cruelty, but a collective of individuals capable of ethical conduct. This period also prompted reflection on her own prior beliefs and assumptions. Indoctrinated for years to perceive allies as merciless, she now confronted evidence to the contrary. The camp forced a reckoning with ideology versus reality. She began to question narratives she had accepted without hesitation, comparing propaganda with lived experience. These reflections, though private, were powerful. They challenged not only her expectations, but also the broader moral frameworks she had internalized. The immediate aftermath of this turning point, both practical and psychological, also highlighted the effectiveness of U.S. military policy. By maintaining humane conditions, consistent routines, and ethical leadership, the camp minimized unrest and facilitated cooperation. It was an operational success as well as a moral one. German prisoners were secure, accounted for, and increasingly willing to engage constructively with their captors. At the same time, the U.S. military reinforced its international standing, demonstrating adherence to the Geneva Convention and setting an example for the treatment of prisoners. By the end of January, the young woman had begun to navigate the camp with confidence. She still carried memories of battle and loss, but the initial shock had evolved into comprehension. What had begun as disbelief transformed into a measured understanding. The war was not only a clash of armies, but also a confrontation of ethics, humanity, and moral choice. Her experience foreshadowed broader implications. Across the United States, thousands of German prisoners were undergoing similar transformations, experiencing the dissonance between expectation and reality, adapting to humane treatment, and internalizing lessons about discipline, morality, and leadership. For many, these experiences would linger long after the war, influencing their understanding of authority, justice, and human behavior in ways that propaganda and indoctrination had never allowed. The story of this young woman, quiet and unassuming as it may seem, reflects the subtle power of ethical conduct in war. Her adaptation to life in the camp, her internal reconciliation of expectation versus reality, and her growing comprehension of her captors, humanity, all point to a larger truth, that even amidst conflict, the choices of individuals and the systems they create can leave an enduring mark on those they encounter. As weeks turned into months, the young German woman fully settled into life at Camp Clinton. What had initially been an overwhelming shock transformed into routine acceptance, tempered by reflection. She observed the same patterns repeated daily. Guards enforcing rules calmly, nurses attending the sick, and fellow prisoners slowly adjusting to a life bounded by order yet infused with decency. The consistency reinforced a lesson she could not ignore. Humane treatment was not a weakness. It was deliberate, disciplined, and profoundly effective. Letters sent home, cautiously phrased to avoid censorship, hinted at disbelief without directly praising the enemy. Many prisoners expressed amazement at the structure, food, and medical care. Some described guards who spoke politely, while others noted the predictability of inspections and roll calls. Across multiple camps in the United States, a consistent pattern emerged. German prisoners were documenting moments of unexpected kindness, carefully noting that these experiences challenged everything they had been taught about the Allies. For the young woman, this correspondence became a tool of reflection. Writing to her family, she struggled to articulate the nuances of what she had witnessed. How could she convey that a soldier, armed and trained to fight, could also be compassionate? That discipline could coexist with empathy. These letters reveal a subtle but profound shift. The prisoners were internalizing lessons about human decency that could not easily be erased by wartime ideology. Meanwhile, U.S. military records reflected the practical benefits of humane treatment. Camp reports consistently highlighted reduced unrest, minimal disciplinary incidents, and efficient prisoner management. By fostering an environment of fairness, the Army achieved operational objectives while simultaneously demonstrating adherence to international law. Leaders at every level took note. Ethical treatment was not only morally defensible, but also strategically sound. In practice, compassion became a tool of order. The young woman's personal transformation mirrored these institutional observations. She began to see her captors as individuals rather than abstractions, capable of moral choice even within the context of war. She assisted new arrivals, offered guidance to fellow prisoners, and even mediated minor disputes. Her evolving role illustrated a subtle truth. Humane treatment could inspire cooperation and responsibility even in those initially resistant. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing under the weight of military defeat. News filtered into the camp slowly, carried by newspapers and word of mouth. Prisoners processed the downfall with a mixture of resignation, disbelief, and reflection. For her, the contrast between the chaos of defeat in Europe and the orderliness of life in the U.S. camp was stark. Here, amid snowy barracks and disciplined routines, the war had become comprehensible, manageable, and, paradoxically, human. The long-term impact of these experiences extended beyond the war. Oral histories and memoirs collected decades later reveal that former prisoners frequently recalled their time in U.S. camps as formative. Many emphasized the shock of humane treatment, the unexpected kindness of guards, and the realization that authority could be exercised ethically. For the young woman, these lessons endured, shaping her perception of leadership, morality, and human behavior in profound ways. The broader implication was clear. The humane handling of POWs left a lasting mark not only on individual captives, but also on post-war relations and reconciliation. Soldiers who returned to Germany carried stories that challenged entrenched narratives, humanizing the former enemy and planting seeds for understanding in a post-war world. For some, the experience became a moral benchmark, an example of how ethics, discipline, and human decency could persist even amidst the machinery of conflict. By the end of her captivity, the young German woman had completed a profound transformation. The shock of initial disbelief had evolved into comprehension. The alien kindness of U.S. soldiers had become familiar, and the lessons learned within the camp would stay with her for the rest of her life. What began as a personal confrontation with the unexpected had become a reflection on humanity itself. Even in war, ethical choices could shape outcomes, influence behavior, and leave enduring impressions on those who witnessed them. In this way, Camp Clinton and the broader system of humane POW treatment was more than a containment facility. It was a moral arena where assumptions were tested, beliefs challenged, and empathy demonstrated in small, transformative acts. And for the young woman who first arrived in disbelief, it was a place where the stark realities of war collided with the quiet power of human decency. In the quiet of Camp Clinton, amidst orderly barracks and disciplined routines, a young German woman confronted a truth that the war itself could not teach, that humanity does not vanish in the midst of conflict. The shock she felt upon witnessing the calm, measured kindness of US soldiers was not merely personal. It was emblematic of a deeper principle. Even in the machinery of war, ethical choice endures. Discipline and authority, when exercised with care, can coexist with compassion. Her experience challenges the simplistic narratives often told about enemies in wartime. She had been trained to fear, to expect cruelty, to see the opposing side as irredeemably monstrous. Yet, in practice, she found that morality could be structured, that decency could be procedural, and that humanity could survive even within the strict confines of a military system. The realization left an indelible mark, not only on her understanding of war, but also on her perception of people, leadership, and ethics. Beyond the individual, her story reflects a broader lesson about the nature of conflict and the potential for moral integrity under pressure. Across the United States, thousands of German prisoners encountered similar lessons. Small acts of care, structured fairness, and consistent discipline, each instance quietly undermining fear and indoctrination. The cumulative effect was profound. The war became not only a struggle of armies and weapons, but also a testament to the enduring power of ethical action. In the end, the significance of Camp Clinton was not measured solely in order or efficiency, but in the quiet victories of conscience. For the young woman, the disbelief she first felt transformed into understanding, the rigid lines drawn by ideology blurred before the reality of humane conduct, and the enemy she feared became, in unexpected ways, a mirror of what human beings could be at their best. History often records battles, strategies, and outcomes, but the true measure of warfare lies also in these subtler moments. Moments when kindness survives, when order is paired with empathy, when humanity prevails against expectation. For those who witnessed it, like this young German soldier, the lessons endured long after the guns fell silent. War, she realized, could be brutal, but it did not have to strip away the essence of being human.